Have you been to Cape Cod and taken a tour of Plymouth Colony? And that is that historical recreation of the village that was built by the Pilgrims, those Pilgrims who came to our continent back in the early 1600s. It's eye-opening to see how these early settlers lived 400 years ago, which for a historian is just the other day. Now, we have the advantage of sharing a common language with those ancestors. We benefit from the written journals of William Bradford and other settlers, many of which are kept carefully in museums. Now, I've taken groups of confirmation students on those tours, and it's always been fun to see them comprehend the enormity of 400 years and what was life back then and the difficulties that they had to overcome. For a 14-year-old, 400 years sounds like an eternity. So taking that into context, I want you to now think about Moses and those biblical stories and put them even to a bigger number of 3,300 years ago is when we think that Moses lived. And Moses, he went through all these things that are described in the book of Exodus, but that book wasn't written until 800 years after the life of Moses. And those accounts were written by a group of people very, very, very far removed from what Moses experienced. And what we have to keep in mind is that between the writing of the book of Exodus and what actually happened, there was 8 centuries of an oral tradition. For 8 centuries, people went ahead and kept the stories of Moses alive. Chances are they embellished those stories. Chances are they made them a lot more colorful. But in all those stories, there is an essence of truth. In all those stories, there is something that is the core message for us to take away. I find that oral tradition to have been a miracle in and of itself. Because here we are, some 2,600 years after it was written down, and we are reading those passages, almost as if it was written in English just for us. I feel like one of those 14-year-old middle school students trying to comprehend the enormity of the process of when this happened, when it was written, and all the different translations it went through in order for it to reach our program bulletin on this day. And how also something that happened 3,300 years ago is relevant to us today. It's hard to appreciate the work that goes into translating such ancient writings. I made friends with several of my professors in seminary, and some of them were actually scholars that sat down at the table and contributed to the translations of the NIV Bible. That's the New International Version. And I want to give you an idea of how puzzling that scholarly work is of translating such an ancient text. Because they're not just translating from a text that was written in the 1950s. They're not just translating from a text that was written in the 17th century in England. They're doing their best to translate from as close as possible an original copy as they can. So, to give you an idea of that, I want you to imagine how 2,600 years from now, in the year 4623, scholars might look at our lives and our writings and try to make sense of it. So just imagine that 2,600 years from now, scholars are trying to figure us out, and they see that we have an obsession with the word cat. Yes, you heard me correctly. There is something about cats that has infiltrated our daily speak. And I can only imagine how future scholars will interpret the overuse of the word cat. So let's start with the easy ones. That we like to compare people to cats by calling them fat cats or cool cats or a copycat. There are women out there that are called cat ladies. And then there are men that are standing on busy streets engaging in cat calls. And then there's don't let the cat out of the bag, something that's always puzzled me. Who would put a cat in a bag? Look at what the cat dragged in. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Excuse me, will I take a cat nap? Now, who knows what these scholars will think when they read how difficult it is for a pastor to herd cats. And yet, also finding out that we know of more than one way to skin a cat. That's another question. Who would want to skin a cat? Is it because curiosity killed the cat? So I think you get the point. Biblical translators take into account that language is dynamic, language is always changing, but language could also be very metaphorical. Language could be pointing to things that are not to be understood literally. And despite the fluidity of language, today we are reading a story that survived 8 centuries of oral tradition before it was written down. And in our 21st century mind, we may not want to believe that Moses parted the Red Sea. We may think that it doesn't make sense that he was able to extract water from a rock. And so I have to ask, are we missing the point? Several Sundays ago, we had a guest preacher here, the Reverend Drew Willard, and he spoke about the importance of us knowing our stories. He connected knowing our story with developing our faith. And I know that's one of the objectives of church, making sure that the parishioners hear the story over and over again as we all develop our faith. But it's not until moments when intersections happen between life and biblical stories that sometimes it makes sense. It was the spring of 2013, and I was spending a month in the Middle East. And I was there with a small group of people, and we traveled to the Palestinian town of Bilin to observe the celebration of the olive harvest. As musicians were playing in an open field and children ran around, there was a group of women sitting on the ground tending to a rock and clay oven where bread was being baked. Now, this bread did not look like the type of bread that we get from Publix. It was flat, very similar to pita bread, but without the pocket. And allow me to give you a few more descriptions so you can kind of like picture the setting. The air was dry. The air was very, very dry, not this humid air here in Florida that makes you break out into a sweat within a few minutes of being in it. This was air similar to that of Arizona. And instead of lush gardens full of ferns, the terrain was mostly rocky and dusty. Stray dogs roamed freely. Children played, and all the men smoked. I kid you not, every single man was smoking a cigarette. It was everywhere. And then the women wore head coverings. And I was told that they had built their ovens on the ground because not only was it practical, it was away from the structures that might suffer from fire, but also because they wanted to bake bread in the manner that their ancestors did during biblical times. So at one point, a Palestinian man came over to us with a tray of bread, and he told us to go ahead and break off a piece and dip it into a bowl of olive oil. And a woman next to me commented that the bread had been exposed to a lot of dust and that it was covered in dust. Now, the Palestinian man heard her comment, and he turned to us with a smile, and he said that the dust of this land is sacred because it's the same dust that their ancestors walked on, and it's the dust that swirled around the prophets back in biblical times. But more importantly, it's the dust that was created by the divine hand of God. And then the Palestinian man said, "Oh, the stories that this dust could tell us. It's a blessing to have it on the bread." And so we took the bread, we ate it, dusty as it was, and it tasted just fine. A little crunchy, but tasted just fine. Now the lesson to be learned: don't let the small details get in the way of the big picture. In the same way that we had to overlook the specks of dust in order to enjoy the goodness of freshly baked bread, we too must overlook the specks that are in a biblical story, specks that make us wonder exactly how this lines up with our 21st century mind. And so when we read these biblical stories, we got to take a look at the core of the story and see what is it exactly that is coming out to us today, 2,600 years later. What is at the core of the Moses story that matters? What is it that's undeniable about this story despite all the details that don't make sense? Well, for starters, Moses believed that he was sent by God to liberate slaves from the Egyptian empire. And somehow, with the help of God, that's exactly what he did. How do we know? Because in gratitude, people remembered. And in gratitude, people kept that story alive. It's a story that we've heard time and time again. It's a story that even is part of our modern days. Men and women in our times that hear the calling of God and they respond to it for a very, very, very specific purpose. And then those who are the recipients, after it's all done, in gratitude, remember. Now, for us at the Christian church, it's not Moses. It's a man called Jesus. And there's much about his story that people may want to debate. But what's at the core of the story of Jesus? What is it that's undeniable, despite all the dusty details that don't make sense? Well, just like Moses, Jesus was sent by God to liberate humanity. And he liberated us from our own misconceptions to help us experience firsthand the love of God, a love that has salvation, a love that will save us not only from ourselves, but from damnation. And so we have to think about how all this translates. How does it translate when we say this is the bread of life? What is it that we mean by this is the cup of the new covenant? Are we able to see the sacred presence of God in those words that were spoken 2 millennia ago, halfway clear across the world, by a man whose life we remember in writing and with our own oral tradition? Friends, whether you believe we are made out of stardust or from the divine hand of God, let us unite on this day with each other, with our brothers and sisters from around this community and around the world, in an effort to make the big picture real, in an effort to make this Christian moment tangible. What is it that matters the most? That God is with us. God is with us at this sacramental table as we partake of the sacrament. God has been with us. God was with us through our travails, through our difficult moments. God is at this very moment with Fred and Dale. And God is with us and with this church, guiding us and moving us forward to a new day where we might be able to extend the love of Christ to one another. Amen.